A Small Town Prisoner by Wanda Bullard. I'm going to be telling you a story about my dad. His name was George Bullard. He was born in a rural area right up the northeast corner of Mississippi that most folks call British County, and the locals just call Paradise. He grew up with 8 other siblings on the farm. He married when he was 20, had 2 daughters, and his wife died, so he raised those 2 daughters. After they were grown, he married my mother, who was about 20 years younger, and they had had another family. So I'm the last of the last. My dad was about 50 years old when I was born, and I was very fortunate to be raised by him. He raised and trained bird dogs all of his life, and that's how he made a living. If the bird dog business got a little slow, he'd paint a house or two and do something like that, but after he got up in his 60s, someone convinced him to get into politics. He ran for Board of Aldermen, which is like the city council, but he was elected by a landslide. Everyone loved him. His assignment was fire commissioner. Now, all the previous fire commissioners did was go to meetings and make political decisions, but my father liked to get involved. So he went to the telephone company and said, "Can't y'all hook up my telephone with one of those fire departments?" So they did. And every time the fire department telephone rang, our phone rang. One long, continuous ring until you picked it up. And then you didn't talk. You just listened to see where the fire was so he could go. And he went to all the fires, day or night. He almost knew nothing about firefighting, but he knew how to encourage young men. So he'd go and encourage them. I got involved because my father was almost stopped driving at night because of his age. And as a teenager, I had a driver's license, so I kept jeans and tennis shoes right there, and I drove him at 3 o'clock in the morning. Well, after a few turns as board alderman, several people, myself included, convinced him not to do that anymore. But he found that he missed the camaraderie, and he had formed all with the firemen. And because of the firemen in the police department, we in the same building, he missed all the policemen too. So he would just go down there to visit every now and again, and this being a small town, they worked out something which might not have been real legal, but they taught him how to operate the police radio. And any time anybody wanted a day off or was too sick, he'd go in and work an 8-hour shift. Somehow they managed to pay him. I don't know how. But one day, he got to his job down at the police department and he discovered, to his amazement, they had a prisoner. I did say it was a small town. It was most unusual. So that morning, he really didn't have much to do. He'd wander back to talk to this young man, and when he went out for lunch, he brought a couple hamburgers back for him. Well, by 1 or 2 o'clock, they had a decision about this young man, and he'd always trusted his instincts about people. He had decided that in spite of being long-haired, way down to here, which my father hated, and that he was a decent man, so that if he could, he'd see if he could get him some help. He started to inquire of him, "Why are you still here? You seem like such a nice young man. Won't anybody come get you out of jail?" And the young man told him, "Well, I had a little too much to drink last night, and they arrested me for drunken disorder, and here I am." My dad said, "Well, what would it take to get you out?" And he said, "Well, I have to pay $200 fine." And my dad said, "Well, why can't your family pay the $200 fine?" And he said, "Well, I think that if I could talk to my father face to face, I could get $200 from him, but I don't know how he's going to react to a whole collection call from the Boonville jail." Well, my dad mulled this over a little while and said, "Well, why don't you think if I turned you loose, you could go find your father and the $200 and come back?" I'm going to remind you that my father's only duty was to operate the police radio that talked back and forth with the cars. So the young man said, "Well, see, I'm from Corinth, Mississippi, and that's about 20 miles north from Boonville. You know they impounded my car. I think I could get the money from my dad, but I have no way of getting up there." And my dad said, "Well, what if I gave you your car?" He said, "They impounded it." And my daddy said, "Well, is it that blue Chevrolet?" He said, "Yes, sir." And then my daddy said, "It's parked out in the parking lot. I can probably find the keys." So he scrounges around in the desk drawers and he finds the keys, and he not only releases the prisoner, over whom he has no authority, he gives him a getaway car. Well, as the kid leaves, my father says, "Now, son, I believe if I could borrow $200 from my daddy, I'd borrow another five to get me a darn haircut. At about 4 o'clock, the policemen start coming back to change shifts, and as they came in, they went back to check on the prisoner. And they discovered, to their dismay, they didn't have one. And they said, "Mr. George, what happened to the prisoner?" And my daddy was busy going with his little closing up paperwork, and he said, "Oh, yeah, I turned him loose." And the police officer said, "You did what?" "Turned him loose." He said, "Mr. George, why did you do that?" Daddy said, "Well, he seemed like a nice young man, and he'll be back in a little while with his $200. And the police officer was kind of taken aback. He'd known my father all his life. My father was like a grandfather to most of those guys. He said, "Okay, well, you take care of this." And he went back to the policemen to try to figure out how they were going to get out of this without my father losing his unofficial job. One of them says, "Well, we ought to remind the chief that George Bullard helped him get elected." But another of them said, "Oh, I got a better idea. Let's just tear up the paperwork and we'll just pretend we never arrested that boy." Well, my father wouldn't hear of it. He said, "Oh, no, I know that boy's coming back. I know he is." And the police officer said, "How can you be so sure? You don't even know him." And my father's answer was simple. "He told me that he would." Well, they didn't know what to say to that, so they just didn't say anything. They waited around. 4:30 came and 5 o'clock, and of course no young man returned. And about 5:15 they tried getting my dad to go home because his shift ended at 5. He's kind of stoic, and he said, "No, I'm going to wait around until he comes back." One of them observed, "Might be kind of a long wait." But no, my dad didn't get discouraged. And all of a sudden the door opens. The young man walks in, plain cut, shaven, short hair, walks up to the counter, and they don't even acknowledge him because they're still mulling over what they're going to do to save my dad. And finally the young man says, "Excuse me, I'd like to pay my fine." And that kind of got their attention. So they didn't recognize him. And one of them walked to the counter and said, "What's this fine you're talking about?" He said, "Well, you guys arrested me last night, locked up. I owe $200 and I'm here to pay it." Started counting out $20 bills and they got to 200 and the police didn't say a word. And they got out the book and wrote him out a receipt. They thanked him and the boy started to leave. When he got to the door to go out, he turned around. Most of what he knew the situation like in that office was with my dad. Said, "Oh, by the way, Mr. Bullard, I'm sorry I was late. Getting back, I just had to wait in line at the barber shop."